Hmm. I've got page 41, chapter 9, Luminous Awakening chapter. Continuing from the two verses we only partially got through last week, I'll say a little more about them tonight. Worked on the translation a little bit, and they roughly go like this, reversing the first and second line. If one looks for the taming and regulating master of peoples in the appearances of virtue and clan, ethnicity, externals, this is like a disease of the eyes, which distorts one's vision. Someone like this can never know or understand or appreciate, maybe better, someone like this can never appreciate the supreme, most supreme Dharma. The second verse almost is, why? It doesn't say that, but why? Thus come one's form and appearance and marks and so forth. Other words, referring to the first line of the previous verse. These characteristics, qualities, cannot be fathomed by anyone in the world. And if throughout millions of nayutas and kalpas one tried to comprehend them, still the dimensions or aspects or variations of these forms, marks, balsam virtue, have turning without bounds. Basically, they are so manifest, so varied, so prolific that you wouldn't be able to nail them down, to put them into a set. So basically, this is taking a concept that you see also in the Vajra Sutra. And the line basically from the Vajra Sutra is the Buddha is speaking to Subhuti, his disciple. And Subhuti was trying to figure out something really fundamental, not only to cultivation but to life, which is how do we find a place to dwell, to abide in, when indeed everything is impermanent and fluctuating. One of his questions. And basically the Buddha responds to Subhuti trying to quell his troubled mind and indicating to Subhuti the troubled mind is brought on by his misunderstanding, his ways of looking things are not clear. And because they're not clear, he comes up with all these doubts and questions. And so what the Buddha is trying to do simply is to bring Subhuti back to the ground of his own naturally awakened state and calm his mind. And in the calming of his mind, the letting go of the grasping and attaching and seeking that's motivating him, he gets freed, he gets liberated. So in the Vajra Sutra text it says someone, and this is the Buddha speaking to Subhuti, someone who looks for me, the Buddha, in form, in appearances, in externals, and seeks me in sound, walks a crooked road, is on a mistaken path. Now this could be also referring to any approach that is sound, sight. You have looks for me in form, that's sight, tries to find me in sound, but you could also have all of the other sensory organs, sight, sound, smells, taste, tangibles, and even in mental imagining. Someone who looks for the Tathagata like that will never find the Tathagata. That's from the Vajra Sutra. This poses a sort of tension or seemingly contradictory dimension to this. One is enjoined to see through the false to find the true. One is enjoined to hold precepts and cultivate various practices, contemplative practices of letting go and calming and the mind and stilling the mental fluctuations and emotional ups and downs, to be able to see things clearly. And yet, there's this sort of movement here not to seek, not to go after, not to let the mind be grasping and attaching. So sometimes Dharma is presented both to point out the absurdity, silliness of grasping, seeking, attaching, and yet at the same time to provide temporary things or teachings to go after and to take hold of. And of course, many metaphors are used to explain this. One is the obvious parable of the raft, where in a situation of danger and peril, one is on a shore that's very unsettled, turbulent, full of obstacles. Could be poisonous animals, snakes, fire, drought, famine, metaphorically, mentally, emotionally. And one wants to get off of this. How does one get to the other shore where none of those things are holding? The parable says, there is no bridge, there is no ferry boat, there doesn't seem a way across. So in desperation, almost pushed up against the wall, you go along the shore and grab whatever you can that floats. Could be bamboo, sticks, or whatnot, and you bind it together quickly with whatever will hold it, twine, not even nails. And you get on the raft and you enter into the stream of crossing over. You're using the stream as and again, the stream is not going across, it's going counter. And so to get to the other shore and not just be caught up in the stream, you have to paddle frantically. And the Buddha says, then when you get to that other shore, having crossed over, no need for the raft anymore, no need for the wild panting, and you can just let it go. So then Dharma here is presented as a temporary expedient that's taken up only because one has got caught on one shore and doesn't know how to get across. The other metaphor that's often used is medicine. Medicine is only required when imbalance occurs in the body, in the four elements. If there's no imbalances, then there's no need for the medicine. If there's no greed, anger, and stupidity, there's no need for Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, the medicine being Dharma. But even if there's a need for it, it's only taken to the degree, to the longevity, and to the regimen, if you want to use that word, until health is restored. Health restored being the natural state. And then the medicine is no longer useful. So what this passage of text is talking about is not only the nature of Dharma, capital D, as being expedient, upaya, but even the teacher, the Tathagata, the Buddha, also is a phenomenal manifestation from wisdom and compassion of a being who takes on different forms and appearances and shapes for the sole purpose of restoring grounding and centering and wholeness in other living beings that he or she encounters. But to mistake the appearance that enlightened being takes, including the virtue that's manifest as the end goal that one then relies on and grabs onto, is what this text is pointing out to, becomes a spiritual sickness. And this is often the word that's used. Because it doesn't restore and bring one back to one's own state of self-reliant whole completeness, but a kind of dependency either on the teachings or the teacher. However, and this is really critical, that dependency is naturally let go of when strength or health is completely restored. And then it's possible and even desirable to let go. Letting go before that is a misstep. It's a kind of false sense of pride or underestimating one's own weakness. So there's a dynamic tension that goes on in the relationship to Dharma and the relationship to teachers, the relationship to study. Study, again, is for the purpose of absorbing a kind of philosophical, spiritual, medicinal structures that allow you to reframe thinking and seeing in such a way as to open up the nature of things as they really are. Once this happens and the corresponding liberation occurs, there's no need for study. And that's why they use the word for someone who's arrived at this stage of sagehood is in no need of further study. It's one of the epithets that are used, no need to study more. But to drop the study before one penetrates is also a mistake, because what you're relying on is an unguided mind, an unguided philosophical approach. And unguided, it will drift and wander. This is the nature of the unawakened mind, is it drifts and wanders from one phenomena, one teacher, one book to another. And it's all very interesting, and it's kind of an encyclopedic approach to knowledge. But in the end, you have a grab bag of just information that doesn't really penetrate. It doesn't really turn into a fire that lights up. And also, it doesn't feed. You feel a kind of empty knowledge that doesn't liberate. So this is called, in the Platform Sutra, liberating knowledge as opposed to just acquisitive knowledge. Knowledge that is just there as something you carry in a bag as opposed to something that actually transforms and liberates. Once a liberation occurs, you become the knowledge, and the knowledge becomes you. The only reason to continue study would be if you are intent on the Bodhisattva path to teach and transform living beings. That being the case, then study becomes extremely important to understand their thought ways, their views, their habits, their emotions, their identities and so forth, their psychology, the way they set up social structures and so forth. Study like that is study that is aimed at the liberation and transformation of others rather than accumulating it for self-aggrandizement or for professing one's own supposed learning. So in the same way that a doctor then takes up an exquisite and detailed study of medicine with the idea of using it to treat the various illnesses of people and continues to read and study and follow all the journals and whatnot, not because he's sort of in a competition game from one-upsmanship with his colleagues or her colleagues, but rather to stay on top of the field of healing. And so this is why a bodhisattva will not only study world-transcending dharmas like these sutras and texts, but will also master worldly teachings and dharmas, because it gives the best window into the potentials and capacities and limitations of human beings across cultures even. It's one of the principles, if you will, of Master Wa's starting of Dharma Buddhist University, was the university was meant to have a broad study of the human condition across various disciplines and dimensions, ultimately, yes, to teach and transform and bring people to their original nature, but also recognizing that that sets up and manifests very differently with even different languages, much to say different histories and different psychological orientations and different fundamental values and worldviews. Not to say one is superior to the other. It's just saying that's how people set up. And so if you're going to teach and transform, you have to meet them where they are, where they're setting up. You can't presume that if you know one culture, one dimension, one book, you're going to be able to reach out and extensively teach and transform other living beings. So, what I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight after this is this disease of the eyes metaphor, because you see this in many of the text. And it's interesting because it's premised to say we have the inherent capacity to see and know and completely comprehend things as they truly are. This is what you want to say, our original seeing, vision capacity. This is called the nature. 佛性, 自性, 性, the essential nature. Sixth Patriarch says, the essential nature, when working with the activities of the mind completely unimpeded and aware, is able to know all. It's able to see all very clearly. This is a kind of very pragmatic almost approach to what we call all seeing or all knowledge. And it really is not simply based on learning, but a removal of the impediments of klesha, afflictions, that cover over this capacity. And that's why the text here, it's never talked about as a deficiency. It's very interesting. It's talk about a distortion, which is very different than deficiency. Deficiency means you don't have it. You're missing this element. And therefore, as soon as you hear that, the impulse is to want it, to seek it, to go after it. Every time the Buddha nature, the essential nature, is presented in these texts as not fully operative and functioning, often the words are used like this of, it's like a cataract. It's like a distortion of vision. And by nature, to correct your vision is to correct it. It's not to replace it. And it's not to say that you need more eyes. You simply have to use the ones you have unimpeded. So this changes the emphasis from seeking outside to get something you're lacking to correcting and healing and, if I might say, centering what you already have, bringing it into focus. In the same way, if I am shooting with a camera and the photos are coming out blurry and screwy, my first impulse is to say, oh, it's a bad camera, I need to get a good camera, or I need to get a different camera. And then a good photographer will say, what you need to do is focus your lens to the appropriate field of depth that you're shooting at. If you're shooting at a macro, you've got to get it down to that. If you're shooting expansive horizon landscape, you adjust, and it's like, oh, this works pretty well. All I have to do is adjust the lens of the focus. So in this text, when this passage used distortion of the eyes, it's really quite philosophically interesting, but more psychologically should be empowering, because it tells us to put the emphasis back on correcting our vision. Now that's a metaphor. How do you go about correcting your vision? Because vision has to do here with one of the ideas is view, which is dristi. It's a technical term, or diti in Pali. And the Buddha was saying there are certain views, certain deeply embedded habitual ways that we think or believe or psychologically hold to. It's not just like a mild attitude, but it's a deep sort of inbred, habituated way that we look at things that is wrong. And the reason they're wrong is not because they're proclaimed by the Buddha to be wrong, or that they're a priori wrong on their face, but rather they're wrong in the sense that they distort vision and don't lead to true seeing, which then doesn't lead to liberation. They are in fact associated with the klesha. And so wrong view is one of the kleshas. It's one of the standard lines that are given for afflictions. We always think of afflictions as emotional and mental states that obstruct awakening. But here it's also how and the ways in which you think and view things. For example, viewing that there's no cause and effect is a wrong view. Denying causality. Why is it a wrong view? Because if you follow that, you will be making mistakes in cause and effect, but you won't be thinking you're accountable for them. And then you won't understand why things are so messed up. Why is this happening to me? It must be fate, it's probably chance, it's chaos theory, whatever you go down this road. But because you have the wrong view, you can never get a handle on changing the fate or destiny that's evolving from your choices, because you don't believe in causality. So it's a wrong view because it doesn't lead to liberation. A view of a permanent self, unchanging self, again, is one of the wrong views, so forth. Because it doesn't accord with things as they are, and as a result, we're pushing our wrong view and demanding that the world consider us as whole, complete, unchanging, permanent beings. Duh, it's not going to work that way. There's other wrong views. One wrong view is to think that through sheer ritual and devotion and repetitious religious exercise in and of itself will lead to a bodhi. It is a support for cultivating a sensibility that leads to a bodhi, but in themselves do not. This is called using prohibitive ritual, prohibitive morality, thinking that all I have to do is certain rituals and devotions, and then somehow, I guess the gods or somehow beings will then give me liberation. That doesn't mean you don't do rituals and devotions, but you do them with the right attitude that this is about centering and cleansing and returning to one's own nature, rather than seeking outside in the mere performance of ritual that would lead to liberation. So there's different wrong views. But one of these wrong views, I think, here is the idea of the text tonight, is that the Tathagata, the Buddha, the sage, and the awakening of itself, what we call bodhi, exist outside, or they're things. I mean, in Chinese, dongxi, they're actual material objects, or they exist outside the purification and centering of one's own nature. That's a wrong view. And that's what it's saying here. If you look for me in sights and listen for me in sounds and so on and so forth, and think it's in appearances and virtue and marks and so on and so forth, you've got a view that's off. And because that view is off, you'll spend your times, and Huineng is very clear about this, to the end of your days frantically seeking for bodhi and awakening and coming up empty-handed. He'll say it'll end in bitter regret because you're looking in the wrong place. So therefore, he said, return the light, illumine within, look within oneself. This very being is the Buddha ground. Fo zhi xin, this mind is Buddha. Xin zhi fo. Okay, this is the emphasis. And again, it's to return rather than to go outside. So sometimes, because this view leads to a search outside into things and looking for permanence where there's no permanence, looking for purity in what is impure, looking for self in what is not self-existing, and looking for joy and happiness in what is not that. These are called the four inversions, diandao, the four upside downs. The opposite of that are called the four virtues, or the qualities of nirvana, which is complete, quiescent, still, tranquil, undisturbed, klesha-free existence. I'm not going to say, well, nirvana is non-existence. It's not non-existence. Those are called purity, permanence, true self, and bliss, right? And so the four opposites are mistakenly thinking what is pure, taking what is impure as pure, mistakenly taking what is not self-existing as self-existing, what is not joy and liberating as joy and liberation, purity, permanence, and what is impermanent as permanence. So this is, most people, and this is what the text is talking about tonight, follow the four upside downs. going after some kind of sense of permanence and security in what is impermanent, and going after some kind of joy in what is both intangible, inaccessible, and ultimately not deep enough to provide joy. This is what the Lotus Sutra calls using suffering to try to end suffering. Looking for some kind of unchanging, stable thing called me and mine in phenomena that don't provide this at all, that do not exist within our experience, and thus they're imaginary. And yes, although they're imaginary, we pursue them with a vengeance. We lock in, thought after thought, day after day, in pursuit of things that have no fundamental substance or nature of their own. And we pursue them with this, which also is an impermanent, unstable. I mean, if that's not absurd, existentialists talk about absurdity, but this is a profound absurdity. Any event, so the way you correct this is two ways. One, philosophically, you correct it by a right view. Psychologically, you correct it by cultivating to your own being. And in that cultivation, immediately finding a joy and freedom and deep satisfaction that only comes from returning to the root and going back to the source. Once that flavor is there, psychologically, the philosophical starts to make even greater sense and becomes duh. But once the philosophical is there, it gives you a theoretical ground by which to go after the psychological. So you need them both, a combination of study and practice, of right view and right effort. And then there's something that comes of that. This is the laboratory of self-cultivation. So the theoretical or theory correction of this is the one that comes from the same Vajra Sutra, when the Buddha says to Subhuti, in looking at these things for me and awakening, you are mistaking conditioned dharmas for unconditioned. So he says the way you look at this is, and the language is, a shooting star, a cataract clouding of the sight, a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble, a dream, a lightning flash, and a thundercloud. This is the way you should look at things. This is the way you should look at phenomena. So the theoretical is given in this verse, and it actually becomes a meditative practice. While you are meditating and while you are moving around, you don't lose sight of the fact that everything is, in fact, like a shooting star, like a dream, like an illusion, like a cataract covering one's vision. Dewdrop, bubble, so you break through mentally, philosophically, the seeking, grasping, frustrated consciousness, the use of consciousness for that. But you also can use this as a deeper level of meditation. When you enter meditation, quickly that grasping, seeking mind then goes after altered states of consciousness and spiritual dharmas. And so Master Juri said at a deeper level of meditation, if you get to a point where you are troubled by your seeking and grasping and meditation and your mind will not rest, then you use this technique. You just say, okay, let's have it. Whatever I'm seeking, whatever I'm worried about, whatever I think I'm going to get is like a dream, illusion, bubble and shadow, cannot be obtained, fundamentally does not exist. And you break through this analytical application of this contemplation. So you can use it in a worldly way to balance and see things clearly and not get so hung up and so caught up in things. But you can also use it in a spiritual way to catch yourself from going after what you think is dharma. So I'll give you, Master Hua's commentary at this point is really quite good. And he's talking about the teaching this way. The teaching is spoken because there are people. The medicine is prescribed because there is sickness. The Dharma which the Tathagata speaks cannot be grasped. It's like sweeping the floor when it's dirty, dusty. Who speaks? Who sweeps? Two questions there. Who speaks? Dharma. Who sweeps the dusty floor? The Dharma spoken is Dharma dust, which the Tathagata sweeps away. It cannot be grasped. It is not a Dharma and not a Dharma. What Dharmas are there? There are none. There isn't anything at all. And then basically he goes back to quoting Hui Neng, Beng Lai Wu Yi Wu. Basically there's not one thing where it can dust a light, meaning the nature is whole and complete of itself. We don't understand that, we grasp at things, but even Dharma itself is not Dharma, because that is not something to be grasped. It's only a catalytic device to cause us to let go of the grasping. So when you hear basically there's not one thing where dust can light, it should not cause terror or fear, but it should actually comfort and stabilize to say, I'm okay. Everything's okay if I could only break through my misconstruing way of seeing things. And then Master Hua goes on. Basically, the Buddha Dharma does not need to be studied. No one is apart from it. And everyone is capable of knowing it and understanding it. When grasping and attaching is relinquished, the Buddha Dharma appears. If attachments are not relinquished, the more one grasps, the less one has. Before everything has been put down, nothing can be picked up. It's necessary to put aside attachments, let go of them with the left hand, and with the right hand, pick up the real marked prajna. But to say, he cautions himself here, but to say one can pick up prajna is just a figure of speech. So I can remember coming in and looking for liberation, awakening, wisdom, and Master Hua would just say, if you can't let go of what's false, how can you pick up what's true? If your hands are grasping what is false, there's no way for you to pick up the true. So unless you let go of the false, there's no room for the true to be positioned. And the emphasis, you see the emphasis even there in those early days, I came in seeking. And he reversed the psychological impulse to seek, to get, to want, and say, if you don't let go of what's false. And so the emphasis was on letting go, not on getting. But then, this is beautiful because he cautions even himself. He says, if you don't let go, how can you pick up? However, to say one can pick up prajna is just a figure of speech. Wow. That is not to say there is actually something which can be grasped with the hands. If one could grasp all of empty space in one fist, then one could grasp hold of the real marked prajna. If you're unable to grasp all of empty space with one swipe of the hand, one should not make a futile attempt to clutch at real marked prajna. Real mark, and by the way, this is talking about, again, we used it in the verse, marks or appearances, xiang, is the characteristic, that which appears has a characteristic mark to it. This is referring to an expression in Buddhism that says the real mark is without marks. The real, I guess what you'd call the real quality or the real characteristic of the teaching is that it doesn't have characteristics and marks to it. So, all things are basically within real mark, prajna. How could a firmer grip than that be had? It is simply because of attachments that the basic substance of the Dharma body has not been obtained, and one's original face not recognized. And then he goes back to Hui Neng. And this is beautiful. You have the two verses. The first verse is Shen Shou's verse. Bodhi's like a tree, the mind a mirror stand bright, constantly brush it clean and let no dust alight. Master Hua picks up on this commentary and says Dharma, sweeping clean, and so forth. So he uses a sweeping thing, but basically there's no sweeper and there's no sweeping. So then it says, basically, Bodhi doesn't have a tree, nor does it have a mirror stand bright. Essentially, there's not one thing where it could dust a light, which is Hui Nung's verse to balance this. And yet, in the Platform Sutra, the fifth patriarch says, Shensho's verse is very useful and important. And if you cultivate this, you will not be born in the evil paths, and you will attain incredible goodness and virtue and good, and so on and so forth. So do it. Pick up and use this Dharma. However, it's important to also listen to what Hui Nung's verse is, because the picking up of that is only necessary because you are temporarily confused and think you have lost it and don't have it. So you sweep clean, you take it up and use it, but ultimately, once you cultivate in this way, you realize it didn't need to be swept away at all. The dust that was there and the sweeping away are both, in a sense, illusory. They're both fundamentally unnecessary. Anyhow, I was going to do, and I ran out of time again, and I'm so sorry. I guess I'll have to put off Heidegger one more week. It's very interesting because at the City of 10,000 Buddhas this week, we had a guest speaker who talked about Heidegger more indirectly, the famous German philosopher Martin Heidegger, through one of his students, well-known students, Hannah Arendt. And the lecture was talking about Hannah Arendt and her philosophy about thinking and so forth. But her teacher was, one of her major teachers was Martin Heidegger. So the reason I wanted to use Heidegger is because he's a Western philosopher, and when I was studying him, I suddenly had the realization that about the same time historically, late 1950s, early 1960s, he was making statements about consciousness and thinking and seeing that actually parallel and corresponded statements and ways of seeing that my teacher, Master Hua, was talking about. And it's very interesting, they didn't know each other. They were from two different cultures. Later on, Heidegger became interested in Buddhist Taoist philosophy, but was primarily a total Western philosopher. Master Hua, I know for sure, never read or encountered Heidegger. And yet, at this time, and it's very interesting what time this occurs, late 50s, early 60s, both of them are pointing to something that I think this text tonight talks about. But I want to go into it fully to bring it out. In short, what I see them in their own ways as two canaries in the mine. The mine is the deep down bowels where miners work in very dangerous conditions. And one of the most dangerous conditions in a mine is obviously the lack of oxygen and toxic gases that can come up. But they're very often like carbon monoxide, you can't detect it. And so you can be surrounded in gas and toxic gas and actually dying and not know it until you're dead. Well, I guess you wouldn't know it if you're dead, but okay, you get the idea. So the miners used to take little cages with canaries with them down into the mines, because the canaries are very, very sensitive to that, much more sensitive than people. And if the canary starts to, or even die, the miners quickly see that as a sign. And so it's called using the canary in the mine to save yourself. So when I was studying this, and I'll go into this maybe next week's talk, both Master Hua and Heidegger were like canaries in the mine to civilization, to humanity at this time. And they were giving indications that we are surrounding ourselves unknowingly in a very toxic gas, which they both talked about having to do with the misuse of human consciousness, and alerting us to the necessity to wake up quickly before it was gone completely. So that is the background. Next week I will go into then Master Hua's thing, which comes out in one of the few prose texts that he wrote called Water Mirror Reflecting Heaven. And then Heidegger's later works that have to do on thinking and what he calls the problem of technology. And in there, it's very interesting to see this parallel lineup. But next week, tonight, Shinhui is going to talk. Oh.
Mic closer, okay.
Got it?
Can you hear me? This one way? Okay. It's okay right now? Okay. It's kind of reflecting what Marty was talking, stay the same frames, seeing with distorted eye. Today we return from our weekly trip from Redwood Vihara, Santa Cruz Mountains. And it's kind of amazing when someone enters to the forest, what you can see. This beautiful, tall, majestic redwoods. I think we're surrounded by not toxic gas, but by fresh oxygen, but kind of heal. You can feel it in the skin, almost, in your lungs, when you deeply breathe. It's very quiet. You go further in the trail, you can notice rotten wood, partly touched to the soil. Sticking out from the soil. And our neighbor Dan, who lives close to the monastery, he says, look at this. This was railroad clippers. Railroad clippers. And this kind of reminded us what was in the forest like 150 years ago. It's a lot of the trails, it's a lot of wonderful trails what we can walk. And before were they're very busy railroads when everyone carry freshly cutted redwoods. And I was kind of reflecting what those wooden cutters, the lumber companies, they saw when they see the forest. Maybe wood, maybe something what can benefit, maybe trophium, right? It takes a while to cut the huge, big tree, redwood tree. Some of them are quite massive, like 410 feet and 200 or 240 feet tall. And like for the team of the 5 men, usually it takes 2-3 weeks to cut by axes and saws the tree. This is like a huge operation. It's quite amazing. You can Google and see this brave man's very kind of proud standing next to the cutted wood would grow like 1,000 years. So what they saw when they look at on the trees and the forest. And in this area, unfortunately, the clear cut happened twice. They changed the saws and axes to the power tools. They used the gas. So in the 1950s, to clear the whole area takes much more faster than before. And I think in 1991, Master Hua decided to bought the land, to create a kind of sanctuary, to protect this forest for the future generations, to preserve the nature. And I can see what Master Hua was seeing in the forest. I can look at on this as a space when people and the animals and the trees kind of coexist, can grow. And now we have a monastery there, and it's quite a humbling place for me. First to show how I was disconnected from the nature, and to learn how to to be among these trees, animals. Kind of the first days where I feel fear, especially when we look in the night. Now it's like they're more and more closer, much more heart kind of open up. And yesterday we have a chance to stay with a few friends visited us, and we have a chance to sit in the circle among the trees. Very normal gathering, I can say, but at the same time and quite extraordinary to sitting on the soil, kind of breathing and kind of feel, if I can express this the word and the state is connection to something greater than just myself. Of seeing a deep kind of pattern, how we coexist together, that we are not owners of this land, but guests. Try to learn how to care, to be stewards of this land. And I also hope that this sanctuary is not the sanctuary for the animals, but also the sanctuary for consciousness, for human consciousness, that we can learn to be quiet, learn to not be distracted by thousands of technologies and so forth. So, just want to share a few reflections of this being in the nature and learn to see nature with maybe less distorted eyes, and kind of have appreciation that we still have these resources. Not everything is gone, but definitely we to kind of bring our consciousness and learn how to protect what we already have for future generations and for ourselves as well.
Actually, the name is called Redwood Vihara.
Vihara.
Right.
Right. Redwood Vihara, what is, sometimes we call it Redwood Brahma Vihara, what is the place when the gods dwells, or when we can cultivate the four hearts, loving kindness and compassion, equanimity and sympathetic joy.
This is an old tradition too. The locating of monasteries and viharas and hermitages in the woods, in the mountains, in the forest. And often they have the name Lin, like Bao Lin or Shao Lin. Lin being a picture of two trees.
Two trees.
So there's something ancient about the idea of finding one's nature in nature. Basically what you're talking about. What's interesting, 2022, it's still going.
Still going, yeah. And you heard, Marty, the story on some point Ajahn Pasan, when he was in the Thailand and the forest was in the danger to be cutted, so he ordained the trees. Because no, we cannot do it, and he actually chose the big ones, the really big, but you still believe there are devas and dwells there and some spiritual beings.
They already have awesome deportment.
Like trees.
Straight and tall, yeah, like standing in a tree.
Yeah.
Like a redwood. Also, they're used in the Chan tradition. There's a wonderful poem, I think it's from Shu Yun, who basically noted that like the redwoods, they stay green throughout the whole season. And he said the Chan cultivator also stays green through the various stages of life and the various ups and downs, doesn't lose that steady green, pure color. Means unmoved by the changing conditions.
Wow.
Yeah, great stuff.
So we have some announcements. So, do you have anything particular in the upcoming?
The Four Fearless Heart Spot.
All right. If you wish, you can join. We have kind of sort of online, offline retreat. We're doing together with Service Space, and This is called 4 fearless hearts. You can cultivate and learn about the 4 hearts, what I just mentioned before. What is the dates for that?
March 26th to April 2nd.
Ma-
Last week of March.
March 26th to April
2nd.
2nd. You can find a link on our website. And we do our everyday practices. Many of them are streamed online. 4 a.m. Morning ceremony. We have meditation 6:15 a.m. 7:15 Dharma reflections, and 7:30 3 steps 1 bow, and at 12 recite the Buddha's name, and 6:30 we have evening ceremony, and tomorrow at 7:30 Rev Heng Sure will continue his lecture on Avatamsaka Sutra. We stream directly from Gold Coast, Australia, and you can look at on our website, and hopefully you can join us.
Our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of painters into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. 3 vows. Bowing respect to the Venerable Master.